I thought my ex-husband Arthur was stopping by my new custom-built estate to finally sign the last of the lingering divorce papers. Instead, he walked right past me, tossed his vintage leather duffel bag onto the imported oak floor, and casually asked which side of the master bed I preferred. He didn't know that by the end of the night, he wouldn't even have a roof over his head. The sheer audacity of his sudden arrival left a metallic taste of adrenaline thick on my tongue, but I forced my expression to remain perfectly blank. I needed to see exactly how far his greedy delusions stretched before I dropped the legal hammer I had been meticulously preparing for weeks. But to understand the absolute poetry of his upcoming downfall, you have to understand exactly how I ended up standing in the foyer of a $2 million home, staring down the man who had quite literally left me to starve. It didn't start with sprawling mansions or hidden millions, but with a grueling, exhausting climb up the corporate ladder of Chicago's most ruthless legal firm. I was an insecure, profoundly overworked junior partner who truly believed that love and stability were things you had to purchase with endless, backbreaking sacrifices. And Arthur, with his impeccably tailored suits and calculated, charming smiles, had seemed like the ultimate return on that painful investment. My childhood had been an absolute masterclass in feeling hopelessly inadequate and perpetually burdensome. I was raised entirely by my mother, Irene, a deeply bitter woman who never missed a single opportunity to remind me of my physical flaws and my father's supposed abandonment. According to her endlessly repeated narrative, my father, Tony, had simply walked out on us when I was barely 2 years old, leaving her to shoulder the heavy burden of raising an awkward, overly sensitive daughter. I grew up believing I was profoundly unlovable, plagued by a slightly too prominent nose, unruly hair, and a desperate, suffocating need for validation. I tried to make myself invisible at home, pouring all my nervous energy into academic perfection, hoping that straight A's would somehow compensate for my lack of natural grace. The only person who ever saw past my awkward exterior was my next-door neighbor and childhood best friend, Jean. Jean was a broad-shouldered, fiercely protective amateur hockey player who spent his youth breaking noses on the ice and his evenings patiently fixing whatever was broken in my fragile world. We had grown up practically sharing a sandbox, but it wasn't until middle school that I fully understood just how vital Jean's presence was in my life. I remember coming home in absolute tears one crisp October afternoon, utterly humiliated after a group of older boys mocked my profile in the cafeteria. Jean had found me hiding behind the bleachers, my face buried in my knees, wishing the cold concrete would simply swallow me whole. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pretend the boys hadn't been incredibly cruel. Instead, he yanked me to my feet, dusted off my jacket, and looked me dead in the eye. "You carry that nose like a flag, Marta," he had told me, his voice rough but infused with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "You're smarter than all of those idiots combined, and one day they'll be begging to work for you." From that moment on, he was my immovable anchor, the quiet, steady force that kept me grounded through the chaotic years of law school and the grueling bar exam. While my mother offered only criticism and cold indifference, Jean offered rides to the library, late-night diner coffee, and a silent, protective presence that demanded absolutely nothing in return. By the time I finally made junior partner at the firm, I had successfully built a thick, polished armor over my lingering childhood insecurities. I wore tailored designer suits, lived in a pristine downtown condo, and measured my self-worth strictly in billable hours and successful corporate mergers. It was during a sweltering, unbearable July heatwave, when the firm's central air conditioning spectacularly failed, that Arthur seamlessly inserted himself into my carefully controlled life. He was the logistics manager for the upscale HVAC company contracted to fix our building, but you would never have guessed his profession from his pristine, unruffled appearance. While everyone else was sweating through their expensive silk blouses, Arthur stood in my office looking perfectly composed in a sharp charcoal suit, assessing the broken vents with a cool, clinical eye. I remember snapping at him out of sheer exhaustion, my voice sharp and unreasonable, completely losing the professional composure I had worked so hard to cultivate. Instead of getting defensive or walking away, he simply offered a calm, slightly amused smile and suggested I step out for iced coffee while his team worked. The very next evening, I walked out of the glass lobby doors and found Arthur leaning casually against the hood of my car, holding a massive bouquet of dark red roses. He apologized for startling me, his voice smooth and incredibly persuasive, and smoothly asked if he could take me to dinner to make up for the heat wave. Our courtship progressed with lightning speed, driven entirely by his relentless, methodical charm and his perfectly timed declarations of commitment. He wasn't overly romantic or poetic, but he offered a solid, practical vision of the future that deeply appealed to my exhausted, overworked brain. He talked constantly about our shared goals, about merging our finances to build a sprawling suburban house, and about creating a legacy that no one could ever take away. I was so blinded by the sheer relief of finally being chosen, of finally feeling like I was enough for someone, that I completely ignored the small, nagging inconsistencies in his behavior. When I excitedly told Jean about my engagement over beers at our favorite dive bar, my best friend simply stared at his pint glass, his jaw tight and his eyes completely unreadable. "Are you absolutely sure about this guy, Marta?" Jean finally asked, tracing the rim of his glass with a thick finger. The sudden tension in his broad shoulders made me defensively cross my arms over my chest, annoyed that he wasn't immediately celebrating my happiness. "Of course I'm sure, Jean," I replied, forcing a bright, artificial smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "He's stable, he's successful, and he actually wants to build a life with me. I thought you'd be happy that I finally found someone who takes me seriously." "I take you seriously," Jean muttered quietly, almost under his breath, before forcing a tight smile and raising his glass in a stiff toast. "If you're happy, I'm happy. Just keep your eyes open, okay?" I brushed off Jean's concern as mere overprotectiveness, diving headfirst into wedding planning and the complex logistical merger of my life with Arthur's. Jean had insisted, with uncharacteristic stubbornness, that I reach out and invite my estranged father to the wedding, arguing that I would regret it if I didn't at least try. To my profound shock, Tony not only answered the phone on the first ring, but his voice cracked with overwhelming emotion the second he heard my name. He showed up at a quiet park near the venue just before the ceremony, looking sharp in a tailored suit, completely shattering my mother's long-standing narrative of a destitute, uncaring deadbeat. He handed me a stunning bouquet of cream anemones and a thick envelope stuffed with cash, his eyes brimming with tears as he kissed my cheek and whispered how proud he was. When I handed the thick envelope to Arthur later that evening, my new husband's eyes practically lit up with a greedy intensity that made my stomach briefly, inexplicably drop. But the wedding went off without a hitch, and we settled into a comfortable, deeply routine marriage where I provided the massive corporate salary and Arthur managed all of our joint investments. For the first 4 years, life was a smooth, predictable sequence of high-end restaurants, luxury vacations, and perfectly orchestrated dinner parties. I handed over my paychecks willingly, trusting Arthur's confident spreadsheets and his smooth assurances that our custom-built dream house was merely a few profitable quarters away. But the illusion of our perfect partnership began to violently unravel the moment rumors of a massive financial scandal hit my law firm. The senior partners started holding closed-door meetings, the atmosphere in the office grew incredibly toxic, and the very real threat of sudden bankruptcy loomed over all of us. Instead of leaning in to support me, Arthur began taking long, hush phone calls on the balcony, always shutting the glass door firmly behind him. He changed the passcode on his phone, started bringing his laptop into the bathroom when he showered, and frequently came home smelling faintly of high-end scotch and unfamiliar cologne. Whenever I tried to express my terrifying fears about losing my job, he would pat my shoulder absently, his eyes glued to his screens, and tell me I was simply overreacting. The cold, heavy sensation of dread officially moved into my stomach the morning I found the first concrete piece of the puzzle hidden in his leather briefcase. I was frantically searching for a pen before rushing to the office, but instead, I pulled out a glossy brochure for a luxury high-rise apartment complex across town. Clipped to the back of the brochure was a signed lease agreement, dated for the first of the following month, with only Arthur's name listed as the primary tenant. The heavy brass keys to our condo suddenly felt like lead in my pocket as I stared at his familiar, sweeping signature, completely unable to process what I was seeing. A cold sweat dragged its icy fingers down my spine, even though the morning sun was already baking our bedroom through the large floor-to-ceiling windows. I desperately tried to rationalize it, telling myself he was renting it for a client, or setting up a private office space for his new consulting venture. but my heart was hammering somewhere in my throat, completely ignoring my brain's frantic, pathetic attempts to maintain the crumbling illusion of my marriage. When I finally confronted him that evening, the heavy silence in our living room felt infinitely louder than any screaming match could have ever been. He didn't look guilty, he didn't apologize, and he certainly didn't try to offer me any of the comforting lies I was so desperately waiting to hear. "I found the lease, Arthur," I forced out, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it as my own. I tossed the glossy brochure onto the glass coffee table, watching it slide until it bumped gently against his crystal whiskey tumbler. "I was going to tell you on Friday," he replied, picking up his glass and taking a slow, remarkably steady sip of his drink. He looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I had interrupted a golf game rather than uncovered the destruction of our entire life. "Tell me what exactly?" I demanded, my hands clenching into tight fists at my sides to hide their uncontrollable shaking. "That you're moving out? We're supposed to be a team, Arthur. My firm is going under, I might lose my license, and you're secretly signing leases behind my back." "Exactly, Marta. Your firm is going under," he stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or empathy, completely shattering the illusion of the man I thought I married. "I didn't sign up to drown with a sinking ship. I need stability, and right now you are nothing but a massive, unpredictable liability." The sheer cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping in the center of our expensive rug. But the nightmare was only just beginning, a multi-layered cake of absolute betrayal that would take me completely by surprise. The very next morning, the senior partners officially announced the firm's immediate dissolution, handing us cardboard boxes and telling us security would escort us from the building in exactly 1 hour. I walked the 3 miles back to our condo in a torrential downpour, completely numb, carrying 5 years of my professional life in a damp, rapidly disintegrating box. I fumbled my wet keys into the lock, desperate for the familiar comfort of my home, only to find the apartment completely stripped of anything valuable. Arthur's clothes were gone, his expensive espresso machine was missing from the counter, and the small safe hidden in our bedroom closet was hanging wide open. Panic finally clawing through my numbness, I grabbed my laptop, my fingers slipping on the wet keys as I desperately logged into our joint banking portal. The little blue loading circle spun on the screen for what felt like an eternity, mocking my rising terror before the numbers finally populated on the stark white background. 0. The checking account held exactly $0.00. I frantically clicked over to the high-yield savings account, where we had been faithfully depositing my massive bonuses for our future dream house. 0. My hands shook so violently that the laptop slipped from my lap and crashed against the hardwood floor, the screen cracking in a jagged web of colorful static. He hadn't just left me because I lost my job. He had meticulously planned this departure for months, quietly bleeding our accounts dry while smiling at me over dinner. The coffee in my mouth turned to bitter ash, and my legs instantly turned to absolute water, forcing me to slide down the wall until I hit the floor. The silence in the empty apartment was deafening, the kind of absolute, ringing silence where you can actually hear the chaotic destruction of your own life. I sat on that cold floor for 6 hours, completely paralyzed by a toxic mixture of profound shock and deeply ingrained self-hatred, before I finally found the strength to call Gene. He arrived in less than 20 minutes, kicking the partially open door wide, his broad frame instantly filling the terrifying emptiness of the room. He didn't ask stupid questions, and he didn't offer empty sympathies. He simply scooped me up from the floor, grabbed my soaking wet box of office supplies, and drove me straight to his place. For the first 3 weeks, I slept on his worn leather couch, staring blankly at the ceiling while Gene quietly cooked meals I couldn't eat and handled the frantic calls from my former colleagues. It was Gene who finally forced me to open the thick envelope of legal documents Arthur's slick corporate attorney had unceremoniously served me via a smirking courier. The divorce papers were a masterclass in legal theft, utilizing a broad power of attorney I had foolishly signed years ago to completely shield him from any financial liability. "He took everything, Gene," I whispered one night, wrapping my cold fingers around a mug of tea that had long since gone completely tepid. "My salary, my savings, my pride. He even maxed out the credit cards under my name the day before he left." Then we fight him, Gene stated firmly, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. You're the smartest lawyer I know, Marta. You don't just roll over and let this piece of garbage walk away with your entire life. I have no money for a prolonged legal battle. I choked out, a hot, metallic tear finally escaping and tracing a burning path down my cheek. He knows exactly what he's doing. He structured the transfers perfectly. I have absolutely nothing left. You have me, Gene replied instantly, without a single second of hesitation, his voice so fiercely convicted it actually made my breath hitch. And you have your brain. We'll figure this out, Marta. I promise you he is not going to win. Just as I was slowly gathering the fragile pieces of my shattered confidence, the universe decided to throw another massive, entirely unexpected curveball directly at my head. My phone rang late one evening, displaying an unknown number, and when I answered, my father's weak, incredibly raspy voice filled my ear. Tony was in a hospice facility just outside the city, his body rapidly failing from an aggressive illness he had kept entirely secret from everyone. I rushed to his side, completely abandoning the complicated legal drafts I was attempting to build against Arthur, and spent the next 3 months sitting vigil in his sterile room. It was during those long, incredibly quiet afternoons, surrounded by the persistent hum of medical machinery, that my father finally told me the devastating truth about my childhood. He had never abandoned us. My mother, Irene, had intercepted his letters, returned his massive child support checks, and threatened to move out of state if he ever tried to contact me. He handed me a faded, battered shoebox entirely filled with decades of returned birthday cards, graduation presents, and desperate letters begging to see his only daughter. The profound realization that my entire childhood had been carefully built on my mother's toxic, vindictive lies hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. All those years of feeling inadequate, of desperately trying to earn the love of a mother who was actively destroying my life, suddenly violently crashed down on me. When Tony peacefully passed away holding my hand on a rainy Tuesday morning, I didn't just lose the father I had barely known. I lost the heavy, suffocating burden of my past. A week after the funeral, I sat completely frozen in an ornate leather chair in a prestigious downtown law firm, listening in absolute disbelief as Tony's estate attorney read his will. My father, the man my mother had branded a worthless loser, had been an incredibly shrewd and highly successful commercial real estate investor. He had quietly amassed a massive fortune, and because I was his only child, he had left absolutely every single penny, every property, and every stock portfolio directly to me. He wanted you to be completely safe, Marta, the elderly attorney told me gently, sliding a thick folder across the polished mahogany desk. He watched you from afar your entire life. He knew about your recent struggles with your ex-husband, and he wanted to ensure you never had to rely on anyone ever again. The sheer magnitude of the inheritance was utterly staggering, completely wiping out my debts and instantly elevating me into a sphere of wealth I had never even dared to imagine. I didn't tell my mother, completely cutting off all contact with her the moment I walked out of that attorney's office with my new, beautifully unburdened reality. Instead, I took Jean with me to view a sprawling, custom-built modern estate nestled on 3 acres of pristine, heavily wooded land just north of the city. The house was a breathtaking masterpiece of glass and imported stone, featuring a massive chef's kitchen, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private lake, and a sweeping polished oak staircase. When the real estate agent handed me the heavy, intricately forged keys, the cool metal pressing into my palm felt nothing like the heavy brass keys to my old, ruined condo. These keys didn't represent a trap, or a desperate compromise, or an illusion of stability built on someone else's terms. They represented absolute, undeniable freedom. I spent the next 2 months turning the empty mansion into a home, completely immersing myself in the incredibly healing process of choosing fabrics, arranging furniture, and reclaiming my own space. Jean was there every single weekend, hauling massive boxes, assembling complicated shelving units, and completely refusing to let me pay him a single dime for his time. We were sitting on the sprawling back patio one evening, drinking expensive white wine and watching the sun dip below the tree line, when my phone vibrated violently against the glass table. It was a text message from a number I had blocked, pushed through via an email relay, containing only 3 terrifyingly arrogant words. Nice house, Marta. The cold sweat instantly returned, pooling at the base of my neck as I stared at the glowing screen. My heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. Arthur had somehow found out about my father's death, uncovered the massive inheritance, and tracked down my new, supposedly private address. What is it? Jean asked sharply, his relaxed posture instantly vanishing, completely replaced by the tense, ready-to-fight stance of his hockey days. It's Arthur, I whispered, my voice completely devoid of moisture as I slowly turned the phone so he could see the screen. He knows about the money. He knows where I live. He doesn't step foot on this property, Jean growled, standing up so violently his heavy wrought iron chair scraped loudly against the expensive stone patio. I'll call the gate security right now. I'll have him permanently banned from the entire zip code. No, I said, a strange, completely unfamiliar sensation of icy calm suddenly washing over me, completely freezing my previous panic into something sharp and incredibly dangerous. Let him come. Let him think he still has a right to be here. I want to see exactly what he tries to do. I didn't have to wait very long to find out. The very next afternoon, I was standing in the grand foyer, admiring a massive abstract painting I had just hung, when the heavy oak front door suddenly swung open. Arthur strode into my house with the absolute, unearned confidence of a conquering king, dragging his vintage leather duffel bag behind him. He looked exactly the same as the day he abandoned me, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, his thin lips curved into a smug, highly calculated smile. He tossed the heavy bag onto the pristine floor, completely ignoring my presence for a moment as he slowly looked around the massive, sunlit space, nodding his head in clear approval. The sheer audacity of his arrival was so completely overwhelming that for a fraction of a second, I actually thought I might violently throw up. Arthur, I said, my voice dangerously soft, keeping my hands perfectly still at my sides to hide the fact that my nails were biting deeply into my palms. You have exactly 10 seconds to pick up that bag and walk back out that door before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Trespassing? He chuckled warmly, slipping his hands into his pockets and taking a few slow, casual steps toward me, as if we were merely old friends catching up. That's a very harsh word, Marta. Especially considering we are still, legally speaking, a married couple. My lawyer found a rather interesting discrepancy in the final filing dates. The divorce is finalized, Arthur. I shot back, the icy calm rapidly hardening into a weaponized focus. You abandoned the apartment, you drained the accounts, and the judge signed the decree 3 months ago. You have absolutely no legal standing here. Actually, the judge signed the preliminary decree, he corrected smoothly, his eyes flashing with a dark, greedy triumph. The final asset division was paused because you failed to disclose a massive, pending inheritance during the discovery phase. This house, technically, was purchased with marital funds. Which means, darling, I own exactly half of it. The layered betrayal hit me like a physical punch. He hadn't just come to beg for a second chance. He had actively monitored my father's failing health, tracked the probate filings, and deliberately stalled the final divorce paperwork to claim my inheritance. He wasn't just a thief. He was a highly calculated predator who viewed my entire life as an open bank account. He stepped closer, his expensive cologne filling the space between us, the scent acting as a violently triggering sensory anchor that brought back every single memory of his previous cruelty. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his touch making my skin literally crawl with absolute revulsion. I've decided we should give it another try, Marta, he murmured, his voice dripping with a toxic, entirely manufactured sweetness. You've clearly upgraded your lifestyle, and I've always said you had incredible potential. I'll move my things into the master suite today. We can host a dinner party on Friday to celebrate our reunion. You want to host a dinner party? I repeated slowly, the words feeling heavy and utterly surreal in my mouth, my mind racing through 1,000 different legal strategies. Absolutely, he beamed, completely mistaking my shock for submission. I've already invited a few important colleagues. It will be the perfect way to show off our new estate. Don't worry, darling, I'll handle the caterers. You just make sure you look pretty. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and the final fragile thread of my old victimhood snapped completely. The tears dried up instantly, the shaking in my hands ceased entirely, and my heartbeat leveled out into a slow, powerful rhythm. I wasn't the terrified, insecure junior partner he had abandoned in an empty apartment anymore. I was my father's daughter, I was a brilliant attorney in my own right, and I was absolutely, undeniably done being hunted. I offered him a tight, entirely fake smile, taking a slow step back to create physical distance between us. "Friday," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, the weaponized silence stretching between us for a terrifying moment before I spoke again. "Fine. You handle the guests. But I get to choose the entertainment." That night, I sat completely alone in the massive, dark kitchen, nursing a single cup of black coffee as the digital clock on the stove slowly ticked toward 3 a.m. I didn't sleep a single wink. Instead, I pulled out my laptop, surrounded myself with thick stacks of financial documents, and methodically began setting the ultimate, inescapable trap. I called Gene at dawn, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of panic, instructing him to contact 2 very specific people and have them ready by Friday evening. I then called the most ruthless, highly connected forensic accountant in the city, a woman who had previously testified for my firm, and offered her triple her usual hourly rate to work a complete miracle in 48 hours. Arthur spent the next 3 days strutting around my house like a proud peacock, loudly barking orders at delivery drivers and treating me with the dismissive arrogance of an owner inspecting his property. I simply watched him, saying nothing, my silence growing louder and more dangerous with every passing hour. When Friday evening finally arrived, the house was heavily perfumed with the smell of expensive catered food and the loud, obnoxious laughter of Arthur's sleazy corporate friends. He was standing by the massive marble kitchen island, holding a glass of vintage champagne, loudly boasting to a group of men about the incredible deal he had scored on the property. I stood quietly in the hallway shadows, wearing a stunning, perfectly tailored emerald green dress, waiting for the precise, perfect moment to strike. The doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the loud jazz music playing from the integrated sound system, and Arthur eagerly gestured for me to open it, clearly expecting another one of his sycophantic colleagues. Instead, I swung the heavy oak door open to reveal Gene, wearing a dark suit that barely contained his massive shoulders, standing next to a uniformed police officer and a very stern-looking process server. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded loudly, pushing his way through his sudden, confused guests, his face instantly flushing an angry, mottled red. "Marta, who are these people? Get them out of my house immediately." "This isn't your house, Arthur," I stated loudly, my voice ringing out clearly over the sudden, deeply uncomfortable silence of the room. I stepped entirely aside, allowing the process server to step directly into the foyer. "Arthur Vance," the server said flatly, thrusting a thick, incredibly heavy stack of legal documents directly into Arthur's chest, forcing him to instinctively grab them or let them fall. "You have been formally served." "Served with what?" Arthur spat, completely abandoning his sophisticated persona as he desperately flipped through the first few pages, his eyes widening in absolute, unfiltered horror. This is a lawsuit for corporate embezzlement. This is insane. You can't sue me for funds we shared." "I didn't sue you for the joint accounts, Arthur," I explained slowly, my voice dripping with icy, absolute precision, stepping forward so he could clearly see the sheer power in my eyes. "I hired a forensic accountant. She discovered that while you were supposedly managing our money, you illegally used my power of attorney to secure a massive loan against my personal life insurance policy. A policy you then fraudulently transferred into an offshore account." "That's a lie," he hissed, glancing nervously at his completely silent, staring guests, the facade of his perfect life violently crumbling around him. "You signed those documents. You authorized the tax maneuver." "I authorized a standard transfer, not wire fraud," I countered, the killer line sitting heavily on my tongue, ready to be deployed. "And because you committed federal wire fraud to obtain those funds, our original divorce decree is entirely nullified regarding asset protection. Which means everything you currently own, including the accounts you hid, has been legally frozen by a federal judge as of 3 hours ago." Arthur's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, terrifying shade of gray as his knees physically buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the marble island to remain standing. The layered betrayal he had engineered had just been completely reversed. He hadn't just lost his claim to my house, he had lost absolutely every single penny he had stolen from me, plus massive punitive damages. He looked frantically at his friends, desperately seeking support, but the men were already quietly setting down their champagne glasses and slowly backing toward the front door, eager to escape the radioactive fallout. "You can't do this to me," he choked out, his voice completely stripped of its previous arrogance, reduced to a pathetic, desperately vibrating whine. "I have nothing else, Marta. If they freeze my accounts, I can't even afford a hotel room tonight." "Then you better start walking." Gene suddenly spoke up, stepping forward with his arms crossed, his massive presence instantly shutting down any thought Arthur might have had of getting physically violent. "Because you have exactly 2 minutes to grab that ugly leather bag and get off this property before the officer here arrests you for criminal trespassing." "You're at 0, Arthur," I added quietly, leaning in slightly so only he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "This house was bought with my money, and your future is bought with your greed. Adult games are over. The real ones have just begun." He didn't argue, he didn't scream, and he certainly didn't try to threaten me again. He simply turned, his shoulders completely slumped in absolute defeat, grabbed his vintage leather bag from the corner of the room, and walked out the front door into the cold, unforgiving night. He had left me homeless and broke in a torrential downpour, and now, by the absolute perfect symmetry of mirror justice, he was walking out of a multi-million-dollar estate with absolutely nothing to his name. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing loudly in the massive foyer. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, utterly, and undeniably safe. The remaining guests quickly, awkwardly excused themselves, fleeing the house as fast as their expensive shoes could carry them, leaving only me, Gene, and the quiet hum of the house's integrated systems. Gene slowly walked over to the sound system, reached out, and completely turned off the obnoxious jazz music Arthur had selected, plunging the massive room into a deep, peaceful quiet. He walked back to me, looking down into my eyes with a soft, incredibly tender expression that completely contrasted with his massive, imposing frame. He gently reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, the exact same gesture Arthur had used just 3 days ago. But this time, it didn't make my skin crawl, it made my heart soar. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet space, his thumb gently grazing my cheekbone. "I'm perfect," I whispered honestly, leaning into his touch, finally allowing the heavy, suffocating armor I had worn my entire life to completely fall away. "I am absolutely perfect." 6 months later, the early morning sunlight streamed brilliantly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, painting the imported oak floors in warm, glowing shades of gold. I sat on the sprawling back patio, wrapped comfortably in a thick robe, holding a steaming mug of expensive coffee as I watched the gentle morning mist slowly roll off the private lake. I hadn't heard a single word from Arthur since the night I threw him out. My lawyers informed me he was currently living in a cheap motel, desperately fighting a losing battle against multiple federal fraud charges. My mother had attempted to call once, having finally caught wind of my massive inheritance, but I simply blocked the number and never looked back, refusing to let her toxic presence poison my new reality. Gene walked out onto the patio, his hair completely messy from sleep, wearing a pair of old sweatpants and carrying 2 plates of perfectly cooked eggs and toast. He set the plates down on the glass table, leaned over and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the top of my head before sinking heavily into the chair beside me. I looked at the heavy, intricately forged keys to the house sitting casually on the table between us. They no longer felt like a symbol of a desperate compromise or an illusion of stability. The silence in the house no longer scared me. It was mine, and it was priceless.